Greetings and welcome back to LA Quill. Today we're diving into one of the most deceptively simple questions in all of writing. What exactly makes up a story? On the surface, it feels easy. Characters, a situation, a beginning, middle, and an end. But once you actually sit down to craft a tale that breathes, one that feels alive and immersive, you quickly discover that the process is far more intricate than it first appears. Fantasy especially can lure us into thinking that imagination alone is enough. After all, if you can conjure dragons and kingdoms and ancient gods or entire worlds from thin air, surely building a story around them is an easy thing, isn't it? But as any fantasy writer will tell you, all the magic in the world can't compensate for a story that lacks structure, intention, or emotional resonance. Even the most fantastical epic rests on very real, very human foundations. So today we're breaking down the core components of the story, the ones that every writer, from beginner to seasoned novelist, must master. Characters, plot, conflict, and resolution. Not as abstract literary devices, but as living parts of a tale that shape each other, influence each other, and ultimately give your story its heart. Let's begin where all great stories begin, with your characters. When people think of storytelling, they often picture a plot first. A quest or a murder, a daring rescue, a political coup, or a forbidden romance. But in truth, plots don't exist in a vacuum. They are born from the people who inhabit your world. Characters are the engine of your story. They are the lens through which your audience experiences your world, interprets its rules, and emotionally invests in its stakes. And because of that, character creation has to happen before you worry about what they will do. When I began writing Ariana's tale, I didn't start with the grand arc of the story. I didn't even start with the magic system or the politics of the world. I started with two characters, Ariana and Damek. No plot, no outline. Just two individuals I really wanted to get to know. I explored who they were long before I placed them in a story. I asked myself about their past wounds and their values, their fears, their temperaments, their dreams. I looked at how they carried themselves, how they spoke, what they wanted most, even if they didn't yet realize that that's what they wanted. This is the step new writers often skip, and it's one of the most crucial. Characters developed in isolation outside the pressure of a plot become deeper, more organic, and more internally consistent. Their actions make sense because you already understand how they think. Their decisions feel realistic because you spent time living alongside them. And once you know your characters that well, the plot just begins to reveal itself. That brings us to our next major element, the plot. Plot is a sequence of events that unfolds as a result of your characters. Not the other way around. Your characters drive the plot. Too many writers try to force characters into a predetermined plot shape, a structure designed before the characters ever existed. And while that approach does work for some people, it often leads to characters behaving strangely or inconsistently, simply to keep the plot on track. When you build your plot from your characters, it becomes naturally cohesive. Character motivations lead to choices. Those choices spark consequences. Those consequences lead to new challenges, and through enough of those challenges, the plot evolves. In the case of Ariana's tale, once I understood Ariana and Damek deeply, the story began to form almost on its own. Ariana's personality suggested the kind of trials she would face. Damek's background hinted at the tensions he would inevitably encounter. Their relationship dynamic shaped where conflict would naturally emerge between them, as well as from the world around them. Plot is not a collection of events. It is a chain reaction, a living, breathing response to the people you've created. And this chain reaction inevitably leads to the heart of storytelling, the conflict. Without conflict, your plot stops moving. It's done. Without conflict, your characters stop growing. And without conflict, your story has no pulse, But not all conflict is created equal, especially in fantasy where the temptation to introduce dramatic or supernatural challenges is really high. It's important to remember that conflict must always feel believable within the logic of your world and the nature of your characters. Believability doesn't mean ordinary. Dragons can be believable. Magical wars can be believable. Gods intervening with mortals can be believable. What matters is that the conflict fits the world you've built and makes sense for the characters experiencing it. For example, in Ariana's tale, I could introduce conflicts that wouldn't make sense for a contemporary romance or a sci-fi thriller. Fantasy gave me that freedom. But even within that freedom, the conflict had to align with the personalities, values, and limitations of Ariana and Damek. A conflict that contradicted who they were would have felt hollow, one that forced them into unrealistic behavior that would have broken the reader's trust. Conflict should challenge your characters, not distort them, and it should always push them toward transformation. At some point, that conflict needs to be resolved, though, or at least brought to a meaningful resting point. Resolution doesn't always mean wrapping everything up neatly with a bow. In standalone novels, you might resolve the central conflict completely, that's true. But in a series, you might leave part of the conflict unresolved in order to lead into the next installment. What matters is that you give your audience emotional closure. If something big happened in the story, readers need to feel the impact of it before the story ends. They need to see how your characters have been changed. They need to feel what has been gained, lost, or reshaped. Resolution is not the opposite of conflict. It is its natural consequence. In Ariana's tale, the main conflict came to a full ending, but the story world itself remained full of potential, full of unanswered questions and future possibilities. Even while delivering closure, I was paving the way for the next chapter in a broader narrative, something many fantasy writers need to balance carefully, especially if you're writing a series or you think you might write a series. Now that we've covered the 4 basic elements, characters, plot, conflict, and resolution, let's step back and look at how they interact to create a rich, believable story. Because the truth is that these elements aren't separate at all. They are deeply interwoven, each one affecting the others. Character shapes plot. Plot shapes conflict. Conflict shapes character. And resolution ties it all together. When you master how these pieces work in harmony, storytelling becomes intuitive. You start to see the ripple effects of every decision. You begin to understand that changing one character trait might affect the entire arc of your plot. You discover that shifting the nature of your conflict might transform your story's tone. You realize that your resolution depends entirely on the emotional journey you've taken your characters through. Writing is not simply assembling parts, it's orchestrating them. So how do you, as a writer, especially a fantasy writer, balance these elements in your own work? Here are a few guiding principles to help you along the way. First, take your time with your characters. They are the most important component of your story. Even the grandest fantasy epics hinge on the intimate, personal struggles of the people within them. If your readers care about your characters, they will follow them anywhere. Second, allow your plot to grow from your character's internal landscape, not from your outline alone. You can still plan your story, of course, but make sure there is room for your characters to influence the direction. Let them surprise you. Let their flaws and strengths and desires reshape the path you envisioned. Third, remember that conflict doesn't have to be explosive to be meaningful. Yes, you can include battles and monsters and magical catastrophes or political upheaval. But some of the most compelling conflicts are internal. Fear, loyalty, guilt, love, ambition. These inner struggles often fuel outer action, so use them. Fourth, treat your resolution as a reward, not just for your characters, but for your readers. A thoughtful resolution makes the entire journey worthwhile. And finally, trust your instincts. Many writers get stuck because they're afraid of doing something wrong. But there is no universal formula for storytelling. The contents of a story are shaped as much by you, your voice, your imagination, your values, as by any writing principle. Your story is not an assembly line, it's an act of creation. Mastering these foundational elements prepares you for writing your first novel, but it also prepares you for something even more exciting, writing your best novel. A story that doesn't just function, but resonates. A story that lingers, a story that feels alive. Whether you're working on your first manuscript or your 15th, whether you're outlining a sweeping fantasy epic or crafting intimate character-driven fiction, those 4 pillars will always be the heart of your craft. Characters, plot, conflict, resolution. Simple on the surface, but endlessly rich the more you explore them. And that's our tale from L.A. Quill today. If you'd like to share, tell me in the comments which of these 4 elements you personally find the most challenging or the most rewarding to write. Until next time, may your stories always be magical.